Okay, so imagine you're at a philosophy conference, and you overhear someone say something like, the truck drivers are engaged in a labor strike in virtue of picketing.
Hmm.
And it kind of gets you thinking, right? Like,
Yeah.
what sort of philosophical claim is that
Yeah,
exactly?
yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah.
It's definitely not an identity claim. Like the strike isn't the same thing as the picketing.
Right, exactly. It's not like reducing the strike to just the act of picketing.
And it's not a simple cause and effect thing either. I mean,
Hmm.
sure, the picketing is related to the strike, but it's not the cause of the strike in a straightforward sense.
Yeah, it's more like a symptom or a way of the strike kind of showing itself, right?
Right, and it might be necessary for a strike, but it still feels like there's something deeper going on.
But like there's some deeper connection.
Yeah, some kind of constitutive link, almost like what makes the strike a strike in this case.
Exactly. And that's where this fascinating concept of metaphysical grounding comes in, right?
You got it. That's exactly what we're pointing at. It's all about this relationship of like determination or explanation, almost like what makes something else the case in a really fundamental way.
And it's not just about identity or regular causation or even modal stuff. It's like its own special thing.
It really is. It's about how one level of reality like underlies or constitutes another level.
So it's not just some, obscure philosophical puzzle. This is like right at the heart of metaphysics, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Our sources really emphasize that. Schaeffer even says that metaphysics is basically the study of what grounds what.
Wow. So it's like the central question.
Yeah, and Finance argues that, without grounding, a lot of realist metaphysics would just kind of fall apart.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. It shows you how crucial this concept is. And for anyone who's really into philosophy, thinking about these fundamental relationships of dependence and constitution, it's everywhere.
It's like the glue that holds our understanding of reality together in a way.
I like that analogy. So for this deep dive, what we're going to do is really try to unpack this concept of grounding.
Like get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, we want to explore the different approaches, the debates, the big questions that philosophers are grappling with.
Awesome. So let's get started. So where do we begin with something this fundamental?
Well, our sources lay out some, preliminary groundwork. And right off the bat, we run into this crucial distinction between determination and explanation.
I see. Like, are we explaining something or are we saying what determines it?
Exactly. And that's often framed as the debate between unionism and separatism. It's like a fork in the road for grounding theory.
Okay, so which path do we take? What's the difference here?
Well, it boils down to this. When we say P grounds Q, are we mainly giving an explanation like a metaphysical because?
Mm-hmm.
Or are we pointing to something that determines Q in a way that makes the explanation true?
I see. So it's about whether the grounding is the explanation or if it's something else.
Right. So unionism, that's the view that grounding is a kind of explanation.
Okay, so they're all about explanation.
Yeah, they call it explanation G. So let's take that classic example. The brittleness of a bowl being grounded in its ionic bonds. For a unionist, that just means the bowl is brittle because of the bonds.
So the grounding statement is the explanation itself.
Exactly. It's like a one-to-one thing. And you have philosophers like Descoupta, Fine, Littland, Rosen, they're all in this camp.
And their key idea is that grounding is fundamentally explanatory.
Right. For them, the grounding relation itself does the explaining. There's no separation between the two.
Okay, so that's unionism. Then on the other side, we have separatism.
Right. So separatism says, hold on, grounding isn't the explanation itself. It's more like what makes the explanation true.
Okay, so it's what underlies the explanation.
Exactly. They say grounding is a form of determination G. And they like to use this analogy with causation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, think about it. A stone hitting a window causes the window to shatter. Right. That's like the determination part.
So the impact determines the shattering.
And that causal link is what grounds our explanation of why the windows shatter.
I see. So applying that to our bowl example, separatists would say the ionic bonds somehow determine the bowl's brittleness, but not in a causal way.
Yeah, more like they generated or constitute it.
Right.
And this determination is what then makes our explanation true.
Okay, so it's like a two-step process.
Right. And you have folks like Audi, Schaeffer, Trogdon. They're the big names in separatism.
So for them, grounding is like this fundamental power or dependence that makes things happen.
Exactly. It's like the underlying metaphysical reality that our explanations are based on.
This is a pretty major disagreement, right? Like, are we talking about a metaphysical because, or are we talking about something that makes that because true?
Yeah, it's a fundamental divide. And it gets even more interesting because both sides often argue that their view is conceptually prior.
Oh, really? So, like, which comes first in our understanding?
Exactly. Unionists tend to think we grasp the explanatory connection first, and then we figure out the determination behind it.
So, like, we see that the bowl is brittle because of the bonds, and then we try to understand how the bonds make that happen.
Right. But separatists would probably say, no, no, no. We understand the determination first,
Yeah.
and then we build our explanations on that.
So it's like we see the bonds doing their thing, making the bowl brittle, and then we can explain it.
Exactly. It's a fascinating back and forth about how we even come to understand grounding in the first place.
Okay, so we have these two big camps trying to figure out what grounding is. But how do they actually go about analyzing grounding claims in a rigorous way? I mean, this is philosophy. We need precision.
Right. And that's where regimentation comes in. It's all about developing a formal framework, a precise language for talking about grounding.
So it's like creating a set of rules and symbols to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. And there are two main frameworks that have emerged, predicationism and connectivism.
Okay, so predicationism, I'm guessing that involves predicates.
You got it.
Yeah.
They treat grounds as a regular relational predicate. So you say something like P grounds Q, meaning the fact that P stands in this grounding relation to the fact that Q...
So it's like a two-place predicate connecting two facts.
Exactly. And philosophers like Audi Schaffer-Rosen, they're all about this approach.
Okay, so that's one way to formalize it.
Yeah.
Then we have connectivism. What's their take?
They go a different route. They use a special kind of connective, kind of like because, but specifically for grounding.
So instead of P grounds Q, they'd say something like Q because P.
You got it. And big names like Fine, Correa, Schneider, they're in the connectivist camp.
I see. So it's like they're saying grounding is more about a fundamental logical connection than a relation between facts.
Exactly. They often develop whole logical systems to govern how this because connective works.
Wow. So it's like choosing between a fundamental relation or a fundamental logical operation.
Right. It's a deep philosophical question.
Yeah.
And there are different motivations for choosing one over the other.
What are some of those? Like, why would someone prefer predicates over connectives or vice versa?
Well, some of it's pragmatic. You know, one framework might just be easier to work with for a particular philosophical argument.
Like, it just makes things smoother.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there's also this deeper issue of ontological accuracy. Some philosophers think one framework captures the reality of grounding better than the other.
So it's like they're trying to match their language to the structure of reality itself?
Exactly. It's like be really careful about what we're committing to when we use certain words and symbols.
And I'm guessing these different frameworks come with different ontological baggage.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like if you use the predicate grounds, are you then committed to there actually being a grounding relation out there in the world?
Right. Like, is it a real thing or just a way of talking?
That's a big debate. Some argue that using grounds commits you to a grounding relation holding between facts.
Makes sense. But connectivists might say their because is lighter ontologically.
Yeah, they might say it doesn't necessarily entail a separate relation, but then predicationists could counter that using a relational term doesn't always mean there's a concrete relation.
Right. It could just be a convenient way of speaking.
Exactly. And connectivists might still be committed to something fundamental at the level of facts or propositions, even if it's not a relation.
It's like everyone's trying to figure out the metaphysical price tag of their chosen language.
Exactly. You got to be philosophically responsible about those ontological commitments.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're mainly going to be using the grounds predicate.
Sounds good.
We'll treat it as a relation between facts, and we'll use the standard notation like P to represent the fact that P.
Okay, yeah, that's clear. And we'll assume grounding is factive. So if P grounds Q, then both P and Q have to be true.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So that gives us a working framework, even though we know there's still debate about the best way to formalize it.
Right, it's a good starting point.
Yeah.
Now, the next big distinction we need to tackle is full versus partial grounding.
Okay, so like sometimes something is fully grounded in something else, and sometimes it's only partially grounded.
Exactly. This is crucial for understanding the whole grounding picture. Let's go back to our trucker example.
Yeah.
The truckers are picketing grounds. The truckers are striking.
Right, so their picketing is part of why they're on strike.
But is that the whole story? Probably not. This is almost certainly a case of partial grounding.
So the picketing explains part of why they're striking, but not all of it.
Right. We'd probably need to know more about their demands, their negotiations with the company, the whole context.
Okay, so partial grounding is like one piece of the puzzle contributing to the overall explanation or determination depending on your view.
Exactly. Whereas full grounding gives you the complete metaphysical story all the relevant grounds.
So a full ground provides a totally adequate explanation or determination. No loose ends.
Precisely. Now, a classic example of full grounding is conjunctive facts, like the bowl is brittle and the truckers are striking.
That whole fact seems fully grounded in the two separate facts.
Right. Given that the bowl is brittle and the truckers are striking, nothing more is needed to explain or determine the truth of the whole conjunction.
That's pretty intuitive, but I've heard that even the basic definition of partial grounding is being challenged these days.
Yeah, you're right. Philosophers are never satisfied. The standard definition is that partial grounding means contributing to a full ground. But recently, Leuenberger and also Trogdon and Whitmer, they've presented some cases where a fact seems like a partial ground, but it might not even be possible to supplement it to get a full ground.
So it's like a piece that doesn't fit into any puzzle?
In a way, yeah. It suggests that the relationship between partial and full grounding might be more complicated than we initially thought.
Wow, so even the basics are up for debate.
That's philosophy for you, always digging deeper.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the theoretical groundwork. Now let's see how this actually plays out in different philosophical contexts. Our sources give us these helpful illustrative cases.
Yeah, they categorize them as metaphysical, logical, and conceptual. It's a good way to get a feel for the different kinds of grounding claims.
Okay, so let's start with the metaphysical ones. These are all about how things in the world are connected, right?
Right, like fundamental connections. Our trucker example with the picketing, realizing the strike, that's a good one.
And that fits under functional realization, right?
Exactly. And then you have things like mode determination. Like a truck exists grounds. Its particular shade of red exists.
So the truck's existence makes its particular redness possible.
Right? And we also have Beijing exists, ground. Beijing exists, showing how grounding works in set formation.
So the city grounds the set containing the city.
Precisely. And then there's the classic mereological composition example. Grains of sand exist grounds. The heap of sand exists.
That's a familiar one from mereology.
Yeah. And finally we have the truck is red grounds. The truck is red is true, which is a classic example of truth-making.
So the way the world is makes certain propositions true.
Exactly. So these metaphysical cases cover a lot of ground.
Literally. Okay, so those are the metaphysical examples. Then we have the logical ones.
Yeah, these are interesting because they show how grounding mirrors logical inference rules.
So it's like grounding captures something about the structure of logic itself.
Right, like take conjunction introduction. The bowl is brittle and the truckers are striking is grounded by the bowl is brittle and the truckers are striking.
So the conjunction is grounded in the conjuncts.
Exactly. And you have similar examples for disjunction introduction and existential generalization.
So the truck is red, grounds, the truck is red, or the bowl is brittle, and the truck is red also grounds something is red.
Precisely. It's like grounding is built into the way we reason logically.
Fascinating. Okay, so we have metaphysical grounding and logical grounding. What about conceptual grounding?
These cases are all about conceptual connections and entailments, like the truck is burgundy grounds, the truck is red.
So the concept of burgundy entails the concept of red.
Exactly. And then you have things like trucks are essentially artifacts grounds.
Right.
Necessarily any truck is an artifact.
So the essence of trucks being artifacts grounds the necessary truth about trucks being artifacts.
And also, the figure is a rectangle with equal size grounds. The figure is a square, which is about conceptual definitions.
So the definition of a square grounds the fact that the figure is a square, given the other facts.
Precisely. And, these categories can overlap. Like our burgundy truck example is both conceptual and metaphysical because of the determinable relation between burgundy and red.
Right. So it's not always a clean cut.
And then on top of all these specific cases, we also have these broader, generic grounding claims.
Like determinate property instantiation grounds, determinable property instantiation.
Right. And chemical facts ground biological facts.
That one's interesting. It's like a whole level of reality grounding another level.
Exactly. These generic claims suggest there might be these systematic patterns of dependence across reality.
Like a grand unified theory of grounding. Okay, so we've seen all these different examples, but now I'm curious, is this concept of grounding something brand new, or does it have a history in philosophy?
That's a great question, and it's one that our sources tackle head-on in the section on historical connections.
So is grounding old news or the hot new thing?
Well, it's a bit of both, really. Some people argue that the core ideas behind grounding have been around forever.
Like maybe under different names or frameworks?
Exactly. While others say it's a distinct development in contemporary analytic metaphysics.
So a new way of framing an old problem.
Maybe. But our sources make this helpful distinction between questions of grounding and questions about grounding.
Okay, that sounds useful. What's the difference?
So questions of grounding are about specific instances of one thing grounding another.
Like what grounds what in a particular case?
Exactly, like that classic Euthyphro dilemma. Is something pious because the gods love it? Or do the gods love it because it's pious? That's a question of grounding.
Ah, I see. So it's about the direction of dependence between piety and divine approval.
Right. And philosophers have been asking these kinds of questions forever about all sorts of metaphysical dependencies.
Okay, so those are the specific what grounds what questions. Then what are questions about grounding?
These are more about the nature of the grounding relation itself, like its properties, its connection to other concepts.
So like, is grounding transitive? Is it irreflexive? Things like that.
Exactly. And that's really where contemporary grounding theory focuses.
So the argument is that while philosophers have always dealt with questions of grounding, the systematic investigation of questions about grounding is more recent.
Right. But even that distinction isn't always clear-cut.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, think about historical debates around the cosmological argument for God's existence.
The idea that the universe needs a cause, so there must be a first cause.
Right. That argument relies on the idea that contingent beings need a non-contingent explanation.
So there has to be something that's not contingent on anything else.
Exactly. And that touches on questions about grounding, specifically the possibility of ungrounded things or infinite regresses.
So even though they weren't using the word grounding, they were still thinking about the same basic issues.
Precisely. And then you have those discussions about God being self-caused, which kind of bump up against the notion of reflexivity in grounding.
Right, like can something ground itself?
Exactly. So even without the explicit vocabulary, the underlying concerns were there.
So it's not as simple as saying grounding is totally new or totally old.
Right. The sources suggest that a more nuanced approach is better.
Like looking for conceptual similarities and continuities across different historical periods.
Exactly. It's like with other big philosophical concepts like causation or necessity, the terms and frameworks change, but the underlying problems often remain the same.
That makes sense. It's about recognizing the enduring philosophical questions that transcend specific terminology.
Exactly. So now that we have a better sense of the historical context, let's dive into the nature of grounding itself.
Okay, so what are some of the key characteristics that philosophers have identified?
Well, one of the big ones is the idea that grounding is objective.
Objective, meaning it exists independently of us.
Exactly. Like it's not just a matter of our beliefs or perceptions. Grounding relations hold regardless of what we think.
So it's like a mind-independent feature of reality.
Right. And one way to support that is by looking at how we regiment grounding claims.
So if we can talk about grounding without referring to mental states, that suggests it's objective.
Exactly. And then there's the more directly metaphysical approach, asking if grounding is essentially tied to subjects in any way.
Like, does P ground Q only relative to some particular knower?
Right. The standard view is that no grounding is mind-independent, just like causation is usually thought to be.
So it's like gravity. It doesn't care if you believe in it or not.
Exactly. But our sources do point out that a subjectivist view of grounding isn't completely crazy.
Really? How could grounding be subjective?
Well, especially for unionists who see grounding as explanation.
Ah, because explanation might involve a subject who's doing the explaining?
Exactly. It's like you need someone to explain something to.
So there's a potential tension there between grounding as objective and grounding as explanation.
Right. It depends on how you understand both of those concepts.
Okay, so that's objectivity. Another big distinction is between representational and worldly approaches to grounding.
Right. This is about the nature of the relata, the things that are doing the grounding and being grounded.
Okay, so what are the options here?
Well, the representational view says that grounding is all tied up with our representations, our concepts, propositions, ways of thinking about the world.
So the relata have to involve these representational elements.
Exactly. And you have folks like Fine Rosen who advocate for this kind of view.
Okay, and within representationalism, are there different camps?
Yeah, you have those who think facts are made entirely of concepts, like Phrygian propositions.
So it's all concepts all the way down.
And then you have those who think facts involve both concepts and non-representational stuff.
So a kind of mixed view.
Exactly. Now, on the other side, you have the worldly approach, which says, no grounding is not essentially about representations.
So the relata can be features of the world just as it is.
Exactly. Independent is how we think about them.
Yeah.
Audi and Schaefer are big names in the worldly camp.
I see. So this difference has implications for how we understand facts themselves.
Absolutely. Like, take the facts. The liquid is H2O, and the liquid is water.
So they're both about the same liquid.
Right, but representationalists might say these are two different facts because they involve different concepts.
Whereas a worldly theorist would say they're the same fact because they pick out the same bit of reality.
Exactly. And that can then affect how we analyze grounding claims involving those facts.
It's like the grain of facts matters for grounding.
Right. And this also connects back to the unionism-separatism debate.
How so?
Well, it might seem weird for a unionist who sees grounding as explanation to also be a worldly theorist.
Because explanation seems like a representational thing.
Right. But some worldly unionists argue that explanation can be non-representational too.
So there are ways to make those views compatible.
Exactly. It's all about how you flesh out the details.
Okay, so we have objectivity versus subjectivity and representational versus worldly approaches. What else is there?
Well, we also need to consider some logical properties of grounding, like hyperintentionality and non-monotonicity.
Okay, those sound like some serious logical concepts.
They are. So hyperintentionality basically means that grounding is sensitive to more than just truth conditions.
Meaning it cares about how things are presented, not just whether they're true or false.
Exactly. Like, remember that belief example we talked about earlier? Amy can believe that Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn without believing that Samuel Clemens wrote it.
Even though they're the same guy.
Right. Belief contexts are hyperintentional. And grounding is like that too.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that works.
So if Beijing exists, grounds Beijing exists, you can't just swap in a logically equivalent expression like the capital of China exists and expect the grounding to hold.
So even though those expressions pick out the same thing, the grounding relation might change.
Exactly. It's about more than just reference or truth value.
Okay, that's hyperintentionality. What about non-monotonicity?
This one's about how adding new information can affect grounding relations.
So it's not like classical logic where adding more premises always keeps the conclusion valid?
Right? In grounding, adding new facts can actually break existing grounding connections.
Really? How so?
Well, let's go back to Beijing exists.
Yeah.
Grounds Beijing exists. Now let's throw in a totally unrelated fact like Gomer is a good dog.
So now we have Beijing exists and Gomer is a good dog, but that doesn't seem to ground Beijing exists anymore.
Exactly. The grounding relation is sensitive to these seemingly irrelevant additions.
That's so different from classical logic.
It is. It shows how grounding is more selective and context dependent.
Okay, so we have hyperintentionality and non-monotonicity. What other logical features are important?
Well, there's this whole debate about whether grounding has the properties of a strict ordering.
Meaning transitivity, irreflexivity, asymmetry.
Exactly. Those are the big three. And for philosophers, these properties are really important for understanding how a relation behaves.
So does grounding have them or not?
The dominant view is that, yes, grounding is a strict order.
Okay, so let's break that down. First, transitivity. What's the idea there?
It means that if A grounds B and B grounds C, then A also grounds C.
So it's like a chain of grounding.
Right. And this is often supported by intuitions about how reality is structured.
Like things being built on top of each other.
Exactly. And also the idea that explanation itself is transitive.
If A explains B and B explains C, then A explains C.
Right. It seems to fit with our basic understanding of how things work.
Okay, so that's transitivity. Then we have irreflexivity.
That one says nothing can ground itself.
Which makes sense if grounding is about dependence.
Right, because how can something depend on itself in that way? It would be circular.
Okay, and finally, asymmetry.
That means if A grounds B, then B can't ground A.
So the grounding relation only goes one way.
Exactly. It reinforces this idea of a directed dependence.
So all three properties point towards grounding being a hierarchical relation.
Right. But here's the thing. Each of these properties has faced philosophical challenges.
Really? So grounding might not be a strict order after all.
It's not settled. Let's start with transitivity. Schaeffer has this famous counterexample using a dented globe.
A dented globe? How does that work?
So imagine a metal globe with a dent in it. It seems plausible that the specific way the globe is dented grounds the fact that it has a particular shape.
Okay, so the dent determines the shape.
Right. And let's say that particular shape also grounds the fact that the globe is more or less spherical.
So the shape determines the overall sphericality.
Exactly. But now Schaeffer says, hold on. Does the dent really ground the fact that the globe is spherical?
It seems like the globe is spherical despite the dent, not because of it.
Right. That's the intuition. And that suggests transitivity might fail in this case.
So the dent grounds the shape grounds the sphericality, but the dent doesn't ground the sphericality.
Exactly. It breaks the chain.
That's a pretty convincing counterexample. How do defenders of transitivity respond to that?
Well, Litlin has this interesting response that relies on the distinction between full and partial grounding.
Okay, so maybe there's a way to salvage transitivity.
He argues that the initial grounding claim, the dent grounding the shape, is probably just partial grounding.
So it's not the whole story.
Right. He says a full ground for the shape would have to include not just the dent, but also the fact that the rest of the globe has a certain shape.
So it's like the dent plus the shape of the rest of the globe together fully ground the overall shape.
Exactly. And then he argues that while partial grounding might not always be transitive, full grounding is.
So the second step in Schaefer's example, the shape grounding the sphericality, that's probably full grounding.
Right. And since we can infer partial grounding from full grounding, Litlin thinks we can save transitivity by focusing on the full grounding relations.
So it's a subtle move, but it might work.
It's definitely an ongoing debate. Okay, now what about irreflexivity? That one says nothing grounds itself.
Which seems pretty intuitive.
It does. But Bliss actually challenges the standard reasons for assuming irreflexivity.
Really? How so?
Well, Lowe points out that there might be self-explanatory states of affairs.
Like things that are just inherently what they are.
And historically, some theological arguments have said that God is self-existent or self-grounded.
So God is his own ground.
Right. And then you have Fine and Kramer, who present these puzzles with facts, like some fact or other obtains.
Okay, that's a weird one.
Yeah, because that fact is itself a fact that obtains, and it seems like any obtaining fact would ground it.
So it would have to ground itself.
Exactly. Which would violate irreflexivity.
That's a tricky one. So how do grounding theorists deal with these apparent counterexamples?
Woods introduces this distinction between vacuous and non-vacuous grounding.
Okay, so there are two kinds of grounding.
He says that cases like some fact or other obtains involve vacuous grounding.
Meaning the ground doesn't really tell us anything new.
Right. It's like saying P because P.
It's true, but it's not informative.
Exactly. And he argues that while vacuous grounding might be reflexive non-vacuous grounding, the more substantive kind is still irreflexive.
So it's like trying to separate out the trivial cases from the real ones.
Right. It's a way to preserve irreflexivity for the grounding relations that actually matter.
Okay, so we've talked about transitivity and irreflexivity. What about asymmetry? Are there any challenges to that one?
Yeah, Bliss and Thomson both raise concerns about asymmetry.
So maybe grounding can go both ways.
Thomson gives this example of mass, volume, and density.
Okay, so those are all related.
Right. If density is defined as mass divided by volume, then it seems like having a certain mass and volume grounds having a certain density.
Okay, that makes sense.
But it also seems like having that density and volume grounds having that mass.
So it goes both ways.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah.
But our sources point out that a lot of these reciprocal functional relationships don't actually involve symmetric grounding.
Like what's an example of that?
The classic one is Socrates and his singleton set.
So the set that contains only Socrates.
Right. There's a one-to-one correspondence between them. But the grounding clearly goes from Socrates to the set, not the other way around.
Okay, so even though they're functionally related, the grounding is asymmetric.
Exactly. It's like the set depends on Socrates for its existence, but Socrates doesn't depend on the set.
I see. So you have to be careful about inferring symmetric grounding from just functional relationships.
Right. It all comes down to the underlying metaphysical dependence.
Okay, so the strict ordering of grounding is definitely not a done deal.
There are serious challenges to each property, and the debate is ongoing.
Makes sense. So the last aspect of the nature of grounding that our sources discuss is well-foundedness.
This is a big one for metaphysics. It's about whether grounding chains have to end somewhere.
Like, do they go on forever, or is there a bottom level?
Exactly. Schaeffer's a big proponent of well-foundedness. He argues that grounding chains can't go down infinitely.
Why not?
He appeals to this principle of reality inheritance.
Meaning reality has to come from somewhere.
Exactly. He says an entity or a fact can't just get its reality from an infinite chain of grounds.
There has to be some ultimate source of reality.
Like a foundation.
Yeah.
And this connects to Leibniz's arguments against infinite regresses of explanation.
So for Schaeffer, grounding has to be a cyclic no loops, and it has to end in ungrounded facts.
Right. Those ungrounded facts are the bedrock of reality.
Okay, that's one view. But is there another option?
Yes. Some philosophers like Dixon Rabin and Rayburn and Bliss, they argue for a weaker form of well-foundedness.
So maybe infinite chains are okay.
Well, they say every grounded fact is ultimately grounded by ungrounded facts.
Okay, that part sounds the same.
But they don't rule out the possibility of infinite descending chains.
So it's like you can keep going down forever, but you always have those ungrounded facts at the bottom.
Exactly. They use this analogy of Euclidean space.
Like space is made up of infinitely smaller regions.
Right. And maybe those regions are ultimately grounded in points which are ungrounded.
I see. So it's like the chain can be infinitely long, but it still has to have a starting point.
Exactly. The key difference is whether those infinite chains are allowed or not.
And interestingly, the reality inheritance principle might actually be compatible with this weaker view.
Right, because even with infinite chains, there's still a source of reality, the ungrounded facts.
So the debate is about what kind of well-foundedness is the right kind.
Exactly. It has implications for the structure of reality itself.
Okay, so we've explored the nature of grounding in quite a bit of detail. But now for the big question, why should we believe in grounding at all?
Right. Why posit this whole extra relation when we already have causation and necessity and all that?
What's the philosophical payoff?
That's what the arguments for theoretical utility are all about.
Hmm.
They try to show how grounding earns its keep in our philosophical toolbox.
So it's not just a neat idea, it actually does useful work.
Exactly. And our sources present three main arguments: the unity argument, the explanation argument, and the priority argument.
Okay, let's take those one by one. What's the unity argument about?
This one says grounding is justified because it unifies a bunch of different metaphysical relations.
Like what kind of relations?
Things like functional realization, set formation, constitution, even essence.
And the argument is that these relations are all unified by grounding.
Exactly. The idea is that they're all instances of this more fundamental grounding relation.
So grounding is like the common denominator.
Yeah. Right. And the unity argument typically has three steps. First, it says there's a noticeable unity among all these relations.